Cell communication is critical. If you think of a multicellular organism like humans, we do a lot of things, right, that require communication between cells. So for example, if you want to move your toes, if you want to wiggle your toes, how are you going to do that? So you know that your muscles are controlled by your brain, right? So your brain can generate signals. Okay? And then in order for, so this is your brain, right? And then let's say your toes, are all the way here. So this is your foot and these are your little toes. Okay. So your brain, in order for you to wiggle your toes, your brain will first generate signals, and then these signals will travel all the way to the muscles in your toes. Okay. This is how your brain cells and your muscle cells can communicate. And you can see that, and the signals can travel a very long distance. So it's very important, very vital for the cell communication to happen, so that you can coordinate different activities in your body. All right, so we have two types of cell signaling. You don't have to memorize. Just kind of try to understand. Intercellular signaling takes place between cells. So the example we just talked about between the brain cells and your muscle cells in your foot, that's going to be intercellular. So it's going to be between cells. All right, so that's inter. So think about international, right, between countries. And then the second type is called intracellular. So intra means inside. So that means the cell signaling takes place within a cell. So if this is the cell signaling happens inside the cell. Okay. Next concept is called a ligand. Ligands over here. So the ligands are basically signaling molecules. So there you go. I know the concept sounds hard, but it's really just the signaling molecule. So the next concept is called the receptors. So the receptors are going to be found on the target cells. And the receptors are going to bind to the ligands, and this is how the target cell can receive the signal and then respond to the signal. Okay, so let me draw real quick. Now, I'm not very good at drawing, but I'm going to try. Okay, so let's say cell A and cell B, they need to communicate. So cell A needs to tell B what to do. Okay, so what happens is cell A is going to produce signaling molecule. And if you remember, the signaling molecule is called a ligand. Okay, so it's going to make these ligands and release these ligands. And then these ligand molecules are going to travel. They're going to travel to cell B. All right. And then in cell B, you are going to find receptors. Okay, so the receptors can be on the cell surface or they can be inside the cell. Okay, so that's receptors. So these are receptors. I'm just going to do big R. All right. So once the ligand gets in here, they are going to bind to the receptor. So and again, either they bind on the cell surface or these ligands can cross the cell membrane and then get inside the cell B and then bind to the receptors inside the cell B. So there are two possibilities. It depends on the nature, the chemical property of the ligand molecule. Okay, we'll talk about that in more details later. But this is basically how it works. The signaling cell releases ligand molecules, the signaling molecule ligands, and then ligands travel to the target cell, which is cell B, and then ligands are going to bind to the receptors on cell B surface or inside the cell B. And then once that reaction happens, once these two things, bind, they're going to trigger a series of chemical reactions. And then that's going to kind of, almost like A telling B what to do. Okay, so that's a cell communication. The last thing I need to mention is that the ligand and the receptor, they have a very specific relationship. So a receptor can only recognize the ligand that's specific to it. Okay? So it's a very specific relationship. So it's almost like a lock and key. So lock and key, right? So only the correct key can unlock, right, the lock. So it's very, very specific. So let's say receptor A respond to ligand A. Okay. If they come together, that's going to trigger the correct response. If you have a different signaling molecule, ligand B, the receptor does not recognize ligand B. So they don't have any chemical reactions, so nothing will happen. There's no communication. Okay, so the relationship is very specific. All right, this is just a repeat slide from last week. So I just want to remind you that if this is the inside the cell, this is all, outside the cell. So this is called the extracellular matrix. All right, so the ligand molecules are gonna travel to the extracellular space, outside the cell, and then it's gonna, trigger a response either on the cell surface or, inside the cell if the receptors are inside the cell. All right. Okay, so this is important. Now this picture shows you the different forms of chemical signaling. So the first one is autocrine. So auto means self. So that means the cell is gonna produce signals that target itself. Okay, so the red dots, these red dots are signaling molecules. Again, we call them ligands. Okay. So that's autocrine. And the second form is a cell can target a cell connected to it by gap junction. So you see these two cells, they are connected, right? They're right next to each other. They're connected by this gap junction. So this is one gap junction. Okay. So this is gap junction. So the gap junction, we'll talk about that later. It's like a channel that connects the two cells. And then the signaling molecules, the ligands, can travel through the gap junction. Okay, so that's a direct signaling, okay, through those channels. And then the third type is called a paracrine. Para kind of means on the side, nearby. So in this type of cell signaling, a cell will communicate with a nearby cell. They're not connected, right? They're close, but they don't directly touch or connect it. And then the last one is called endocrines. Endo means inside. So this is signaling pathway that kind of affects the cells inside your body. And then this is a type of cell signaling that can happen over long distance. Okay, over long distance. So for example, the thyroid hormone secreted by your thyroid gland, which is in your neck, can affect pretty much all your cells. Okay, whether it's the cells in your leg or the cells in your organs, so that's a very long distance. So in endocrine cell signaling, the ligands, you see these red dots, the ligands are going to travel in bloodstream and then get to their target cells. Okay, so the blood, the vascular system is kind of like the highway system in our body, right? So they can transport a lot of things throughout your body. Could be gas, carbon dioxide, the nutrients, or hormones. Okay, so cell signaling molecules or released by the endocrine system, they're called hormones. Okay, so all those things can travel via bloodstream to get to their target cell, which may be, pretty far. Okay. All right. So the first one, autocrine, I already mentioned this a little bit. There is a very good example of autocrine signaling, and you might be interested in this. So if a cell is infected with a virus, now the cell kind of knows that it's going to die, so it's going to send signals to itself to undergo programmed cell death. This is more like a sacrifice, right? So if the cell dies, the viruses cannot multiply. So the infection of the virus can trigger the cell to release a cell signal, and then this signal can affect the cell itself and triggers a pathway of programmed cell death. Type of signaling occurs a lot during early development. Okay, signals produced by the cell itself can kind of tell the cell to develop into the correct tissue and develop proper functions. So muscle tissues, like the signals will tell the muscle cells to develop into or undifferentiated cells to develop into muscle cells, okay? Or brain cells, or even skin cells. Okay? So the second one, if you remember, that's direct signaling across gap junction. So these two cells are connected by gap junction. So that's the gap junction. So little tunnels between, or little channels between the two cells. Okay? So usually these gap junctions allow for the transport of ions and nutrients and some other substances. So a good example happens in cardiac muscle. So the cardiac muscle cells are connected by gap junction. So when one cells contract, it's going to generate electrical signals. And then through these gap junctions, the electrical signals, the action potential can travel throughout most of the muscle cells in the heart really, really fast. So this allows most of the muscle cells to contract in a unified manner. Because you want a region of muscle cells to contract at the same time, right? So that generates the maximum force to pump blood. Cardiac muscle cells are connected by gap junctions, and then through gap junctions, the electrical signals can travel very, very fast, through a whole area of cardiac muscles. So they can contract more or less, the same time. So that generates a very large force to pump blood. All right, you can read this later. It's basically a repeat of what I just talked about. There's one new term. I don't require you to know this term, but in the Lumen quiz, you may see this term. So in animals, it's gap junction. In plants, it's a different name. The structure is a little bit different. So it's called a plasma desmata. So that's the gap junctions in plants. All right, next one, paracrine signaling. So this happens between two cells, two neighboring cells, but they don't directly touch each other, or they're not connected by a gap junction. So they're going to be close, but there's a little bit of space in between them. Okay. So in this example, these are two nerve cells. Okay. So this is called, the first cell is called a presynaptic cell. So that's the cell that's going to release the signals, release ligands, and then the receiving cell is going to be called a postsynaptic cell. So this cell is the target cell that receives the ligands. Okay, so this little gap over here, this is called a synapse. So the signaling molecules, the ligands, are going to travel through the synapse, the little gap, and then they're going to affect their target cell, which is the postsynaptic cell. Okay, so what happens is here, the signaling cell contains these neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are just basically chemical molecules, and they're going to be the ligand in this case. Okay, so this cell is going to release these neurotransmitters. So I don't know if you remember vesicles in the cell structure chapter. So these are little vesicles that transport neurotransmitters. So once it gets to the plasma membrane, these vesicles are going to fuse with the plasma membrane and then kind of dump the neurotransmitters out into the synapse, the gap, the little space between the two cells. Okay, so these are neurotransmitter. They're also the ligand. All right. Now on the target cell, you have these receptors. Oh, there you go, receptors. Remember, these are proteins that are going to receive the ligand. So basically, they're going to bind to the ligand. Or more accurately, the ligands are going to move and bind to the receptors. Okay, so the ligands are going to go through this space by diffusion. Remember diffusion from high concentration area to a lower concentration area. So this is a high concentration, this is low. So these ligand molecules are going to diffuse, and once they attach or they bind to the receptors right here, these are all receptors. This is going to trigger a cascade of chemical reactions. And this is how the signal is transmitted from the signaling cell to the target cell. Okay. All right. So this is pericurrent signaling. And then the last one, endocurrent signaling, you know that this involves signaling of molecules which are known as hormones. So the endocrine cells will make hormones. So in this case, the ligands are going to be hormones. Okay, and then the hormones are released into the bloodstream and they travel with the blood, and then they're going to reach their target cells. Okay. Now, in endocrine signaling, whenever you use hormones, it's going to be a very slow response, but it's long-lasting. So think about this process. Because those ligands have to travel long distance, so it's not going to be very, very fast, right? Because it's through blood, so it takes time. So it's a very slow response. But it will last a long time because the ligands, they're not broken down very fast, so they can be present in your body for a long time. So it's a long-lasting effect. Okay. All right, now those are different forms of cell signaling. So now let's take a closer look at the signaling molecules, the ligands. All right, so we are going to cover 3 types of ligands. All right, the first one is a small hydrophobic ligand. When you look at these examples, so this is cholesterol, and these are derived from cholesterol, so that's the sex hormones. And if you remember in chapter 3, we talk about lipids, right? And then all these 3 are one type of lipid called the steroids. So these steroids, they are very hydrophobic and they're not very big. You can see their structures here. So these small hydrophobic ligands can cross the cell membrane very easily. So they can directly diffuse through the plasma membrane. And if you remember, this is called a simple diffusion, right? Simple diffusion across the cell membrane. And then they are going to bind to the receptors inside the cell. So those are internal receptors. And that's because these molecules can cross the cell membrane easily, and then they get inside of the cell. So their receptors are going to be located internally. So these, let me just draw something. I'm just going to make up a shape, okay? So these are the receptors, and these receptors are going to be inside the cell. Okay? And that's because these ligands can get into the cell very easily, so their receptors are inside the cell. All right. Okay. So the second group of signaling molecules are water-soluble ligands. Okay, so these are water-soluble, so that means they're polar. Okay, and if you remember from last chapter, if they're polar, then they can't really cross the cell membrane very easily. Okay, so they're pretty much kind of blocked from getting into the cell, and that's because if you remember, again, it's due to the cell membrane. The plasma membrane structure, right? Because that phospholipid backbone, and this part is the fatty acid tails, which are really hydrophobic. So polar molecules cannot cross the cell membrane very easily. So they can't get in. They're all kind of blocked in here. So that means their receptors have to be on the cell surface. Okay, so they will bind to cell surface receptors. So these receptors are going to be on the cell surface. There you go. Okay. All right. Now there's a little extra information over here. The extracellular domain. So extracellular, that's outside the cell, right? It's over here, and then the domain just means a region of that protein receptor. Okay. So remember the difference between small hydrophobic ligands and the water-soluble ligands. So which one can cross the cell membrane easily and then bind to the receptors inside the cell, and which one cannot cross the cell membrane and can only bind to receptors on the cell surface. Okay, so that's very important, and I'm definitely going to have some questions on the test. And the third group, just other ligands. So for example, gas, like a nitric oxide, they're very small. They don't carry any charge, right? So they can diffuse directly through the cell membrane. And then So tell me this, what kind of receptors do you think they will bind to? Internal receptors or cell surface receptor? Okay. Internal receptors, so internal receptors, or cell receptors on the surface, or cell surface receptors. Okay, I'll give you a few seconds. Right, so if they can cross the plasma membrane, then that means their receptors are going to be internal. Okay, so if they can cross very easily, their receptors will be inside the cell. All right, so the nitric oxide, this is a very interesting fact. They can interact with the receptors in smooth muscle, and then they're gonna cause or induce relaxation of the tissues. Okay. And then we use that to kind of treat heart disease because we want the smooth muscles in the blood vessels to relax so that the blood vessel can be dilated. So this will allow more blood to flow through so that your heart tissues can get oxygen and nutrients. Okay, so we talked about ligands, and now we're going to look at receptors. We have already touched on the different types of receptors. So we have internal receptors, so they're inside the cell, and we have cell surface receptors, so these are located in the plasma membrane. Okay. So here's a question: what kind of signaling molecules bind to cell surface receptors? So which one, A or B? Give you a few seconds. Okay, so if the molecules, the ligands, have to bind to cell surface receptors, that means they cannot cross the cell membrane very easily, right? So the answer is B, water-soluble polar ligands.